It's 5:03 or 5:02, so we're right on time. So good evening, everyone. I see mostly familiar faces, so I think you know me just in case. My name is Serena, and I'm the chair of the Department of Linguistic. I want to welcome you to this very special guest lecture by Professor Gale Stam, Professor America at National League University. So Gale and I, we have been friends. We have been AAA friends for many years. I was trying to remember at least 10 years. And I have a very striking memory of one of the first times I saw Gale. We were both attending seminars, colloquium at the conference about where all the scholars in second level education were gathering and discussing and fighting. Linked around with and so on. And at the end of the conference, I'm going to see the question session. I have this vivid memory of Gale standing up and calling everybody's attention and telling them that they should take a broader perspective and integrate the study of gestures in order to better understand second language. And I was very impressed because it was indeed a very intimidating context. But since then, years have gone by and she has become a well-renowned scholar of this gesture. So I think we're very fortunate to have her with us tonight, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for inviting me.
I also want to express my gratitude to AK and Eddie, who have helped organize and make it happen, taking care of all the logistics. And of course, I want to say thank you to Kimberly Busher and to Professor Urbanski and to Dr. Candidate Amin Nguyen, who are going to present formally our speaker tonight. So,
Thank you.
let's stand closer to here because they're having audio issues.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to talk today. So it is a tremendous honor for me to introduce you today, Dr. Gale Stam, and who I'm so proud to recognize as a member of my dissertation committee. Dr. Stam is Professor Emerita from National Louis University. She received her master's degree in linguistics with an emphasis on teaching English as a second language, and from Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. She earned her PhD in psychology with a focus on cognition and communication from the University of Chicago. Then she worked closely with Professor David McNeil and in the McNeil Lab Center for Gestural and Speech Research. Her dissertation is entitled Patterns of Thinking with Second Language Acquisition. Specializing in the research fields of language, culture, and cognition, first language acquisition, second language acquisition, and gestures, Dr. Stam is a prominent scholar. She has published a number of phenomenal books and articles in prominent journals such as Gesture, the Modern Language Journal, the International Review of Applied Linguistics. She primarily focuses on gestures in second language learning and teaching, researching gesture and multimodality, and thinking speaking, which she will explain to us in her talk today. Some of her notable publications are Thinking Speaking about motion in first language and second language speech and gesture in 2006, Changes in Thinking Speaking, a longitudinal case study in 2015, Gestures as a window to conceptualization in multiple tasks, Implication for second language teaching in 2016, Handling Language, How Future Language Teachers Adapt their gestures to their interlocutor in 2021, that she co-authored with two French scholars. Most recently, Dr. Stam and Dr. Urbanski are publishing an edited volume entitled Gestures and Multimodality in Second Language Acquisition, a research guide, The volume, which will come out later this year, will be a timely and an invaluable resource for any of us who are interested in researching gestural multimodality in second language learning and teaching. And it's also on my reading list. Dr. Gale Stam has received many awards, and she has worked with scholars around the world on a variety of grants and projects. For example, the Spencer Foundation grant for qualitative study of teachers' gestures in preschool classroom 2020 and 2021.
Dr. Stam has been the Vice President of the International Society for Gesture Studies. She frequently speaks at their conferences, and which this summer it will be held in Chicago. Dr. Stam is also co-convener of the ILA Research Network, Gesture, Multimodality, and Second Language Acquisitions. The ILA Research Network is a venue where applied linguists of different backgrounds from around the world meet and share their ongoing studies, get feedback, continue developing their projects, and collaborate on new projects in order to contribute to the field of second language acquisition. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to my dear friend and collaborator, Gale Stam.
Thank you. So I'm just going to begin, and can you all hear me well? All right. So the agenda for today's talk is I'm going to talk first about speech and gesture, so you understand what I mean by gesture. Then I'm going to give you an overview of types of studies, L2 studies that have looked at speech and gesture. Then I'm going to talk about specific studies, 3 studies, one on thinking for speaking, another on multiple tasks, and another on future teachers' adaptations, and then I will have some concluding remarks. So when we speak, we move our hands. And these movements of our hands are not random. They're tied in with our speech, and they are called gestures. Now, gestures can be arranged on a continuum based on whether speech is obligatory and whether there are linguistic properties to the movement. So this continuum has been called Kendon's continuum in honor of Adam Kendon. I will be focusing on 2 kinds of gestures on this continuum: co-speech gestures, also called gesticulation, and speech-link gestures. Before I move to the right of the continuum, I want to make it clear what these gestures are. Co-speech gestures and speech-link gestures only occur with speech. Okay? And the way you understand the meaning of the gesture is by the accompanying speech. How they differ, however, is that co-speech gestures are synchronous with speech, whereas speech-link gestures are not. They fill a gap in the speech. So it's, for example, when someone is having a lexical retrieval.
The shared screen isn't working right.
Oh, no.
Yay, Gale Stam. Okay.
I'll pick up where I left off. Okay. So as I was saying, co-speech gestures occur with speech. They're synchronous with speech. Speech-link gestures occur with speech. They fill in a gap. For example, when you do a lexical search and someone says, he went, and there's the gesture for the gerund. Emblems, which I will not be talking about today, but are very interesting. Well, actually, I will talk about them briefly, are culturally specific gestures, and they differ from culture to culture. They have a set form, like the thumbs up gesture. They can occur with speech or without speech. Speech is not obligatory. Pantomimes, you all know what pantomimes are. It's when you play charades, or like Marcel Marceau, when he did his mimes. They're without speech and you use your entire body. And finally, there are signs. Signs are not gestures per se. Signs are an actual language. They're the building blocks of a language. They have linguistic properties. and they have lexical words, and they occur without speech. Now, there's one other kind of gesture we need to consider that's not on the continuum, and that is pedagogical gestures. Now, often pedagogical gestures are co-speech gestures and Speechlink gestures, but they can also be emblems at times. They are made with conscious awareness for the purpose of teaching. So when you are teaching a language class, or even when you're teaching about applied linguistics, you will make certain gestures so that your students can understand concepts. Now, the position I take on speech and gesture is that gesture is an integral part of language. So that speech and gesture together form a single expressive, integrated co-expressive system. They develop together in childhood and break down together in disfluency. The same areas of the brain are used for perception of speech and gesture and production of speech and gesture. And they represent two aspects of thought, the verbal and the imagistic. And let me just say right now for a moment, we don't just think verbally. We think in many different ways. We think verbally, we think imagistically, we think kinesthetically, and the gestures represent the imagistic aspect of thought. Speech and gesture express the same meanings as well as perform the same pragmatic functions. They tend to occur with elements high in communicative dynamism. So what do I mean by high in communicative dynamism? New information, focused information, contrastive information, and the stroke of the gesture. The stroke of the gesture is the part of the gesture with meaning. It tends to occur with prosodic peaks. Speech and gesture develop from a growth point, and we can think of the growth point as a kernel or seed of thinking. So the model I'm presenting to you is an interactive model in which thought, language, and gesture develop over time and influence each other. It's not that speech influences gesture and gesture only, and gesture influences speech only. It's interactive. They influence each other. And they develop from a growth point, and it is the synchrony, the timing of the speech and gesture that show the growth point. We're talking about thought, and you cannot see thought. You can only access thought through other means. One means is speech, the other means is gesture. So gestures occur in a social and cultural context, and they occur for self and for other. And they're affected by all the same things that speech is affected by sociolinguistically. And gestures perform many functions simultaneously. Some are for others, communicative functions. It's not that it's just cognitive and it's just communicative, it's both. And you can see my gestures doing both. And they provide information about speakers' thinking, learning, and teaching and interactions that speech alone does not. And I will show you some examples of this. So in the past 30 years, there has been an increase in the number of studies on gestures and L2 learning and teaching. And I will just summarize a few of them, and there are references, but I'm not going to go into great detail about them. So some studies have looked at how learners perceive emblems, and some researchers have advocated for the teaching of emblems in language classrooms. And I can't see how you would teach a language and not teach the emblems of that language. I think it's really important. Other studies, and there have been a lot of these and a lot of experimental studies under this group, look at gestures' contribution to vocabulary learning. So do gestures help people learn and retain vocabulary? Pronunciation, particularly tones in a tonal language, and speaking and listening. There has also been research on the effect of gesture and other nonverbal communication on oral proficiency assessments. In some cases, learners are judged higher if their nonverbal language is similar to that of native speakers, even if grammatically the speech is not grammatically correct. It's in the demeanor and how, and some people are judged lower even if they have good grammatical usage, but their gestures are too many. Gesture and nonverbal behavior has also been researched in terms of whether they facilitate listening and discourse comprehension. And particularly in conversation analysis, gesture's role has been looked at in establishing intersubjectivity and joint attention, and also scaffolding, as well as gestures and repairs. And CA calls what I call Speechlink gestures embodied completions. It's the same thing, just different names because of different theoretical backgrounds. Now, teachers' gestures separately from the interaction of gesture in facilitating learning have been looked at. And they have been looked at in terms of their functions in the classroom and word explanation tasks. So one function is to provide information, another is to manage the classroom, another one is to affirm that the student has done something correctly. And corrective feedback. Also, perception of teachers' gestures have been looked at. And in particular, Hogue, H-A-U-G-E, had looked at emblems use in an ESL classroom and found that the use of emblems was very confusing for students. Because if the learners are second language learners and they don't know the emblems yet, they don't know what the teacher's talking about. Separate from teachers' gestures, learners' gestures have been looked at in terms of the rate of gesturing. So there's been some evidence that if learners talk in their first language, there's difference of rate of gesturing between first language and second language, and the order that the task is done in affects that. There's also been research on the type and function of gestures in lexical retrieval and different tasks. And let me add something here. One of the hypotheses about speech and gesture before had been that iconic gestures, gestures that show concrete actions and things, only occurred during lexical retrieval. And that hypothesis was tested and shown that that was not the case. Other kinds of gestures occur during lexical retrieval, and it isn't only in lexical retrieval that iconic gestures occur. How learners mark references with gestures has been examined. And within a Vygotskian sociocultural framework, such topics as mimesis, other regulated and self-regulated private speech, and the zone of proximal development have been researched. So quite a bit of research has occurred in the last 30 years. And I encourage you to read Urbanski and Stam in press once it becomes published, because we have a very good review of this research. The other area where learners' gestures have been looked at is in thinking for speaking. And this is where I turn to next with study 1. So I'm going to give you some background information so you understand exactly what the buzzwords thinking for speaking means. The question of the relationship between language and thought has a long history. Back in the 1800s, I believe von Humboldt's book is 1836, he already talked about how language influenced thought. Other researchers have followed his idea. So some anthropologists and some linguists and psychologists. So this is the question of, does the language we speak affect how we think? And does that mean that speakers of different languages think differently? That's the basis for thinking for speaking. In its present form, there are 2 strands today. One is Worf's linguistic relativity theory. And Worf thought that language affects both linguistic and non-linguistic thought. And there's quite a bit of research still taking place exploring this, particularly in second language learning and acquisition. The other is Slobin's thinking for speaking hypothesis. And Slobin basically said, language affects only linguistic thought, not all thought, linguistic thought. And what does he mean by thinking for speaking? It's the thinking that occurs online in our heads in preparation for and while speaking. Clear to everybody? Okay. So Slobin said, in first language acquisition, children learn a particular way of thinking for speaking. And that this is resistant to change in second language acquisition. So second language acquisition is the perfect place to test this hypothesis. Several researchers, including myself, have said that learners must learn a different pattern of thinking for speaking if the first language and the second language have different patterns, or to rethink for speaking. And there are 2 questions here. How do patterns of thinking for speaking change as learners acquire and become proficient in a second language? And the other question, the one I'm talking about today, is how does gesture enable us to ascertain L2 learners thinking for speaking? So much of the research in thinking for speaking has been in the domain of motion events, because languages differ typologically in how they indicate the components of motion event. So the motion event has several components: motion, the movement itself; figure, the entity moving; path, the direction. There must be a path. If you're moving from one place to another, path is essential. Ground, the object or objects in relation to which the figure moves. And manner, the way the movement is performed. Now, manner is encoded in some languages, but in terms of movement, manner is not as important as path is. So I'm going to, for the one time, get up and illustrate what I mean here. So I'm the entity, Dr. Stam's the entity. I am walking, that's the motion, and in manner, because it's English. Across is the path, and the floor is the ground. Clear? Okay. And then there's cause. What brings about the movement? Because there's both forced movement, which would be because something like Bill threw the ball across the room. The throw is cause. Okay. So based on, I see the thing at the top. Is there anything that can happen with that?
Do you need its building?
Yeah.
Just X out of the bottom left on the right side. On the actual.
You know what? I'm just going to keep going. I don't want to fool around with this one. So, oh, I see, but I don't see that on my screen. So Tommy divided the world's languages into two types based on where path is encoded linguistically. And he called these verb-framed and satellite frame languages. In verb-frame languages, motion and path are indicated by the verb. And manner, if it's present in speech, because manner is optional in verb-frame languages, it's indicated by an adjunct, a gerund, or a phrase. And Spanish is a classic example of a verb-frame language. So in the utterance, y sale volando, the verb sale means exits, it indicates path, and volando means flying, it has manner. In satellite frame languages, motion and manner are indicated by the verb. This is linguistically. And path is indicated by a satellite, a particle or a preposition of movement. Tommy originally said it was an adverb particle, but he expanded to include prepositions of movement in his 2000 book. And English is a classic example of this. And flies out of the cage. The verb flies indicates motion and manner, and the satellite out indicates path. Now, there are problems with Tommy's classification, which I'm not going to go into in great detail. One is it didn't account for languages with serial verbs like Chinese, and Slobin came up with the term equivalentically framed. Also, beyond that, there have been a number of criticisms of Tommy, including that there are intratypological differences even among verb frame languages and satellite frame languages. But we're not going to talk about that today because we're going to look at Spanish and English, and they are clearly verb framed and satellite framed. So what are some of the linguistic and gestural differences in thinking for speaking in Spanish and English? Linguistically, Spanish speakers describe states, and they tend to have elaborate descriptions of settings. English speakers linguistically describe processes, and they tend to accumulate path components in a single clause. So we can say John went through the door, up the stairs, and into the room. A Spanish speaker cannot do this because the Spanish speaker needs 3 verbs to express that. And we then, with 3 verbs, have 3 clauses, not 1 clause. In terms of gesture, Spanish speakers tend to focus their path gestures on path verbs and have separate boundary crossing gestures. So at the end, they have a separate gesture that goes into the end point. English speakers tend to focus their path gestures on satellites, or what I call satellite units, which I'll explain in more detail in a few minutes. They accumulate path gestures within a single clause, and their gestures cross boundaries. So there are clear differences between the 2 languages. Also, Spanish speakers may have manner and gesture when there is none in the accompanying speech, and they may have manner-only gestures. English speakers rarely have manner-only gestures. English speakers rarely have manner and gesture when there is none in the accompanying speech, and they modify the importance of the manner of the verb, either by producing a path and manner gesture, so they're amplifying the manner, or producing a path gesture or no gesture, they're downplaying the manner of the verb. Okay, so we're going to look at a Spanish speaker and an English speaker. I want you to pay attention to a couple things. First of all, the Spanish speaker's gestures are very curvilinear, and he has a separate boundary crossing gesture at the end.
Al momento de que sale, sale el gato, pero con la bola dentro ya, ¿verdad? Y se va directamente.
Falls back down the drain pipe, rolls down the street into the bowling alley straight.
Let me start that again.
Al momento de que sale, sale el gato, pero con la bola dentro ya, ¿verdad? Y se va directamente y es de bajada y entra.
Okay, so you've seen so far it's very curvy. Okay. Now pay attention to these last two. Oh. See, happens when you try cutting it in.
Al momento de que sale, sale el gato, pero con la bola dentro ya, ¿verdad? Y se va directamente y es de bajada y entra un bolerorama. ¿Sí?
So you saw that separate boundary crossing at the end. Okay, here's an English speaker's very economical speech and gesture narration, and the gestures are very linear.
Falls back down the drain pipe, rolls down the street into the bowling alley straight.
Okay, and notice also the use of the verb rolls. So I wanted to see where these path gestures occurred, and I compared it with several motion event categories: verb, satellite, ground noun phrase, more than one, which includes a verb and a satellite, or verb, satellite, and ground noun phrase, or satellite and ground noun phrase, because it's not the case that gestures fall in a single word. They represent concepts. They represent conceptualizations, so they occur over. And then I had a category other to capture where other things occurred that didn't fit this model. And I looked at 5 Spanish speakers and 5 English speakers, and you can see their pattern. And the Spanish speakers, their path gestures tended to occur with the verb and with other. The English speakers, it was more evenly distributed. And the difference was highly significant for path gestures co-occurring with verbs. Okay. So L2 thinking for speaking studies do elicitations of motion event descriptions, because then you can compare across speakers and across languages and within speakers. Their majority of studies have been speech and writing studies, and they examine how path, manner, and ground are expressed linguistically. It's problematic though, because appropriate verbal production does not guarantee that the person is thinking for speaking in the L2, as I will show you shortly. Speech and gesture studies look at how path and manner and ground are expressed both linguistically and gesturally. And they found that there are still L1 remnants in the thinking for speaking of the L2 learners, and that there's also bi-directional transfer. So here is a sentence from an L2 learner. The cat went through the pipe. You can see there's some disfluency, some hesitation, but it's a grammatically correct sentence. There's use of a satellite. So looking at it, you might say the person is thinking for speaking in English in her L2, especially because if you look at a native speaker, it's pretty similar. And he goes up through the pipe this time. However, if you look at the gestures, you see that it's not the same. The L2 speaker has a path gesture on the subject, the cat, on the verb, on the satellite, whereas the native English speaker has one on the first satellite and one on the second satellite. So even though the sentences are pretty comparable, the expression in terms of thinking for speaking is not. So I did a longitudinal study, the only longitudinal study that's ever been done on thinking for speaking over a 14-year period of time. And I wanted to see if the L2 learners thinking for speaking continued to change with regular use and whether this affected her L1 thinking for speaking as well, because there is evidence of bidirectional transfer. And for this, thus far, I've published on 2 cartoon episodes. I'm in the midst of analyzing more data. So I want you to pay attention to the L2 learners' narration in L1 Spanish, 97, 2006, 2011, and then in English. We'll look at the Spanish first. I want you to pay attention to whether the gestures are curvilinear. Why is there no sound? Why is there no sound?
gato
Mhm.
y lo manda hasta afuera.
Oh, okay. Let me go back.
Y se fue rodando hasta el bowling place.
Yeah, the first one has no sound for some reason, but the second works, so.
Gato y
Mhm.
lo manda hasta afuera. Se va rodando hasta el área de boliche y
I'll let it play and then say.
Y baja con la pipa en la panza y se va hasta el lugar de boliche.
Okay, so the one you couldn't hear, she did do a rolling kind of gesture in 97. And in 2006, she did have a separate boundary crossing gesture. Interesting, in 2011, she did not do a rolling gesture. It was much just straight path. Okay, let's look at her English.
Okay, when he came out from the pipe, he went down the bowling place.
I think he goes all out of the pipe and he goes to the bowling place. And then
So a rolling gesture, but no use of the verb roll.
And go down the back all the way to the street, like with the bowling side.
Yeah.
And she just goes directly to the bowling place.
Okay, and she had in English separate boundary crossing gestures all the way through. So findings for this study were that linguistic expression of path and manner, there was no change in her expression in Spanish in terms of path. She used similar verbs. In terms of manner, there was no change in the expression of manner from 1997 to 2006. But in the episodes looked at, she did not have any manner in the 2 episodes. It doesn't mean she didn't have manner in 2011. The other episodes need to be looked at. In terms of English changes, in 1997, she didn't always follow her verbs with a satellite. In 2006, she started to, and she continued through 2011. There was no change in her expression of manner. She never used verbs like roll or fall. She talked about Tweety singing or in a swing with a manner gesture, but she didn't talk about swinging. So in terms of Spanish and her gestural expression of path changed. There was a decrease in path gestures with other, an increase in gestures with more than one element. And this is something that it's very different right here from the L1 monolingual Spanish speakers. And this is something I'm exploring further with more data because I'm curious as to whether her 2 languages, systems of thinking, have in fact become more like one. And there was no change in her boundary crossings. She continued to follow the Spanish pattern. In terms of English, path changed. There was a decrease in path gestures with other. There was an increase in path gestures with more than one. So this is quite interesting. But there was no change in her boundary crossings. She continued to follow the Spanish pattern. In terms of manner, she continued to have most of her manner gestures with no manner in speech, though the percentages started to decline in 2011. So she basically followed this L1 Spanish pattern in both L1 Spanish and L2 English. So take-home message. Examining co-speech gestures is essential in determining learners' thinking for speaking in their L2 and changes in thinking for speaking. As I said before, appropriate verbal production does not guarantee the speaker is using the L2 patterns. Aspects of learners' thinking for speaking can change. So Slobin is right. They're resistant to change, but they can change. But it takes time. Some things are easier to change than others, path in particular. Boundary crossings are more resistant to change, but they can also change with explicit concept-based instruction in linguistic thinking for speaking patterns. And it's gestures and speech together that reveal how learners are thinking about motion. Okay, very quickly, study 2. So this was task effects on speech and gesture. And we know that the social situation and task influences speech and gesture in L1 speakers. There has been a little research on how different tasks affect learners in terms of speech acts and speech in terms of accuracy, fluency, and complexity. And Tabansky looked at gestures during an expository task and during interaction answering questions and found differences in that more presentational, for example, metaphoric and interactive gestures were used in an expository task, and more representational gestures occurred during answering questions, iconic, lexical, and topic gestures. So I was curious. I did an oral proficiency interview for the learner you just saw at the 3 points as well. And I wanted to see how the oral proficiency interview data differed from the narration data. So that was my question. I was also interested in seeing how the oral proficiency interview interaction changed over time. Because, and then what are the implications for second language acquisition? It was the same participant. Interestingly, Here's a social aspect. The interviewer was me and all 3 points, so the same interviewer. But the interlocutors for the narration were 3 different L1 speakers. So that was a different dynamic. I analyzed both the L2 learner's speech and gesture, and I analyzed my speech and gesture during the interview. So what did I find? The oral proficiency interviews were on everyday topics such as school, work, family, and future plans. The narration was a description of 2 episodes of the cartoon. So the type of speech used across the 2 tasks differed, with the speech and the narration being more vivid, so the listener could understand what the learner saw. And the gesture strokes indicated how the learner is conceptualizing utterances and what she thinks is important. So the interview lasted longer than the narration. Makes sense. Narration's a finite task. There were more clauses in the interview than the narrative task. Makes sense too, because they varied in length. There were more gestures per clause in the narration than in the interview, because the narration is a clear description of motion events. There were differences in the dimensions of gesture. The interview was primarily abstract representations, metaphoric gestures, whereas the narration had primarily iconic gestures, concrete representations of actions and objects. And there was a change in the interview. There was a development of common ground and a shift to 2 equal participants. So you've seen the narration already. I'm not going to show that to you. And you remember that there were several path gestures there. I'm going to show you just the interview, and I want you to pay attention to her 2 path gestures.
And then actually I sent my resume twice through the online.
So through the and online. Okay.
And go down the back all the way to the street. And then actually.
So here's a transcription. You can see the path gestures in the narration, and you can see the 2 path gestures in the interview, which is very important because we don't just have to look at motion events. We actually do this in everyday speech. Time our path gestures with satellites. Okay, so what were some of the changes in terms of the interviews themselves? In 1997, there was no overlap of speech or gesture. L2 learners starts out sitting on hands. Interviewer starts out holding hands in lap, later his arms across body. We're strangers. First time we met. Typical body movement language in first encounters, right? 2006, again, there's no overlap of speech or gestures. We both start out with our hands in our lap, and many of our gestures are close to our laps. But then there's a shift in the interaction. The L2 learner asks me a question about my life, and I make a very weird metaphoric gesture, something like this, and I answer her question. But it shifts the perspective. So in 2011, there's overlap of speech and gestures. Both of us produce relaxed, reduced speech and lots of gestures, including interactive gestures. And I want you to look at this.
Their children are
it's
incredible.
Just so nice to see everyone's personality.
Yes, I think so.
Yes.
And it's because it's really interesting because it's really there from the moment they're born.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, So this is her personality. At first, she's getting confirmation that this means personality. Then she moves it to the side, which is showing development of personality. I do an interactive gesture towards her, almost touching her, I think it was. And then I pick up the same gesture for personality. I'm not going to show you the transcript. So the take-home message, we need to look at both speech and gesture. Tells us how learners are conceptualizing and what is important. We saw that in the interview data. Very important. One task is not a sufficient measure of a learner's proficiency and ability to use an L2. So if any of you are teaching language, it's really important to consider task effects, social effects, and we need to provide language learners with the opportunity to engage in multiple tasks in different contexts. This is what we do every day when we speak. We should do the same for our L2 learners. Okay, last, and I think I'm okay because we had some last study. We know from previous research that native speakers adapt their speech to non-native interlocutors. It's called foreigner talk. Ferguson talked about it. We do this to facilitate comprehension. We use more basic terms, shorter sentences, present tense. We articulate more. We speak more slowly. We sometimes talk more loudly, thinking that that will facilitate, and we use gestures. Only one study had looked at whether there were any adaptations done in terms of gesture. And this was a study by Tom Adams in 1998, and he did it in a narration task. And he had native speakers narrate the cartoon Canary Row to other native English speakers and non-native speakers who spoke Korean. And he did not find any significant difference except for the use of deictic gestures. Deictic gestures are pointing gestures. So we were curious, my collaborators and I, whether future teachers, people who are used to teaching language, future language teachers might adapt differently. You know, they might make more adaptations. So we designed an interactive word explanation task. There were 10 participants, 10 future teachers of French, 10 native French speakers, 10 non-native French speakers. And the non-native speakers were at least at the B1 level. And they had randomly from a box, and the interlocutor had to guess. There were 3 nouns, 3 verbs, 3 adjectives, and 3 adverbs. The words were drawn randomly, as I said. The order was counterbalanced, and they could not use any cognates, and they could not use any form of the word. And they had no limit on time. And speech and gesture were analyzed. So what did we find? Future teachers produced more gestures in the non-native condition. They produced gestures of longer duration in the non-native condition. They produced more illustrative gestures, iconics and deictics in the non-native condition. And these results were significant, I should add. And they produced larger gestures in the non-native condition. So here is an example of a future teacher describing a word that the interlocutor has to guess. And I'm just going to do the English translation for a moment. So she's saying basically when you go up a tree, and her gestures in center space here. Okay. She says to the non-native speaker, when one goes up a tree, so all she does is change her pronoun, but her gestures are up here. to make it more visible to the non-native speaker. Here, the native speaker, in talking to the native speaker, the future teacher says, for the pedestrians, and she does not produce a gesture at all. Common ground of language and culture doesn't mean that you don't need to produce a gesture. With the non-native speaker, she says basically the same thing. For the pedestrians, she has a little repetition, and she starts producing an iconic gesture of walking. So she clearly changed her gestures. And one more example. Here, to the native speaker, the future teacher says, it's a verb, a synonym of rock climbing, and produces a metaphoric gesture, holding the verb in his hand. To the non-native speaker, he says, it's a verb, synonym of rock climbing. So the exact same speech, and he's producing an iconic gesture of climbing. So, take-home message. Speakers adjust not only their speech, but also their gestures in addressing non-native interlocutors. Both speech and gesture need to be examined in interaction to understand what occurs during communication. The study itself is relevant for language teaching and sheds light on the gestures that future teachers use. And pedagogical gestures should be considered in teacher training to make teachers more effective in the use of gestures in the classroom. And I want to end with one example and then my final concluding remarks. So if we look at this speech transcript, can anyone tell me what you see? You see that the person is having difficulty expressing herself. There are a lot of filled pauses, a lot of unfilled pauses. It doesn't necessarily make sense by just looking at speech, right? Speech tells us really nothing, except she's having difficulty.
And the Tweety, the Tweety has a bowling ball, and he ate.
So when we look at speech and gesture, we see that she was trying to say that Tweety threw the bowling ball, but she didn't have the words, but her gestures tell you what she's saying, and that she also abandoned it and talks about the ball and that he ate it, and she didn't mean Tweety ate it, she meant Sylvester ate it. So it's very important to look at speech and gesture together. So my conclusion, to get a complete picture of second language learning and teaching, co-speech gestures need to be considered. As I said at AAAL many years ago, as Corinne reminded me. Gestures can help in learners' understanding of the second language and culture, and they can facilitate learning. People adjust not only their speech, but also their gestures to their interlocutors in interaction. Gestures disclose not only what learners are thinking, but also how they are thinking. And speech and gesture are two windows onto the mind. Gestures provide information not present in speech, and I need to qualify that. Sometimes gestures can provide the same information that's in speech. Sometimes they can provide additional information that's not in speech. Thank you.